G'day and welcome to the Unprofessionals podcast. After a small hiatus of a small amount of time, about a year, we are finally back, and today we have military aviation history, aka Chris, aka military aviation history, professional as always. And we are absent Laobi. If anyone sees him, please return him or drop him into the lost and found section so we can collect him. But today we have myself, Deadmeat, and Mags, and Chris. So, Chris, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Chris, military aviation history on YouTube. I like aircraft and I make videos about aircraft. That's pretty much all you need to know.
So,
well, you neglect to mention you're also an author these days as well. You're a little bit beyond that.
Yeah, so I have written a couple of books. We can talk about those, I guess, a little bit later on. And there is also a little bit of announcement I can make on that as well for later on.
Nice.
Oh, there we go. I wasn't aware of this.
Yeah. So
anyways, guys, it's Mags. Wow. Hey.
We
are unprofessional after all.
Yep.
All right, guys. It has been about a year since the Unprofessionals podcast was up. I'm sorry if I sound a little scattered at the moment. I am running a little bit behind. Basically, real life, COVID, and a degree on my end caught up, and there just wasn't time to be able to fit these in. But we're back now, so we're going to be going through a few more. There's already a couple more scheduled up.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really all there is to it.
Yeah, just life happened, and it was horrible. So, yeah, and anyway, so
I think the last year has been quite different to everybody's expectations, right? I mean, this is quite normal that you guys had to take a break.
Yeah,
I think honestly, it would be in everybody's best interest to just forget the entirety of 2020 happened. Just put a big line through it. There are very few things that should be erased from the history books. This might be one of them that, maybe archive it somewhere, but otherwise it doesn't really have a whole lot of use.
Just in future researchers in 2050 are going to ask, why is 2020 not on the map? Yeah.
Well, wouldn't it be like the Dark Ages? It wasn't that the technology was bad. It's just that there was a whole lot of documentation. Was it documentation that just went very, very scarce during that period? Not really sure.
I mean, generally, I think I'm not an expert on this, but what I heard about in school is that, especially after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, a lot of their documents, just went up in flames and were destroyed, and that's how the Dark Ages happened, so to say. But I'm not an expert on that.
As I understand it, same thing. A lot of cities got put to the torch, and general education standards kind of went through the floor, which actually isn't
technology
overly difficult. Yeah, isn't overly difficult today either. Well, let's not get into that subject. I've got kids at school.
that gets way too close to politics, and that's something we avoid here.
Talking about things that are impressive, and I've got both of them in my hands here right at the moment. I'm actually sort of hoping Deadmeat might actually have a couple of photos come around. Author of 2 books. This is not something that most YouTubers do, and I am bloody impressed. I have copies of both. Actually, I believe I have the original print of the and it's a typical German naming that I can never get the mouthful out of. The Panzer book, the first one. I believe I actually have the original print of it, including the mistake in printing that had to be corrected as well.
Yes.
So I'm keeping this one put aside, and at some point I am hoping to get a signature on that from you, because there won't be too many of those.
Yeah. So now I actually, being the consummate professional that I am, I actually don't have photos prepared for this, nor do I actually have the books on hand, because I actually got them for my father-in-law.
You know what? I am an absolute legend. I have a phone that has Discord on it, and I have both books literally sitting in my hands. I can fix this. I can fix it.
Yep. Put it into the podcast notes channel, and I will put them up on the screen for people to see. But, so, well, firstly, can you explain when Mags mentioned the printing error? Can you
Oh yeah.
explain to us what actually happened there?
What happened? So yeah, essentially, the book was finished, was done, and we had everything in order, and we sent out the printing instructions, and we had a couple of different batches. Obviously, I believe we had 3 batches that were being printed, and one of the batches had a mistake in the file, which we're not quite sure how it exactly happened because we uploaded the same files. We uploaded the same documents to the printer, and one of the things that we did with the book, of course, is this is a translation of a German army manual, the HDV 470-7 Mittlere Panzerkompanie from Mai 1941, which is a big, long German title for essentially German army regulation of the medium tank company from May 1941, which is an even longer title there in English, actually. And one of the things we do in that book is we have the original document if you just open the book on the left side, on the left page, and on opposite of that, on the right-hand page, you have the English translation. And what had happened in the misprint in the batch is just that one rogue page was inserted all the way in the beginning of the book, and that completely messed up the layout. So luckily, we were able to identify the exact batch where this has happened, and we resent copies to everyone. And it was a bit annoying, but it's sadly, it's one of those things where this was the first time that we essentially brought out a book. And when I say we, obviously, I also mean Bernhard Kast, Military History Visualized. People might know him from YouTube as well. We're both the co-authors on that. It's a collaborative project, and we're able to rectify that issue this way. Was very annoying. Obviously, we were quite nerfed off by that, but we're happy that we identified the batch and everybody got a second book.
Yeah. Well, I also got one of the misprints, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't be upset by that at all. If
I'm
know
not.
through your book history, the misprints like that become collector's editions, and these things are that detailed at the moment. These are going to be used by as reference materials in the future, like straight and simple. These are really, really, really good. Actually, I need to ask straight away. I know the assault platoon is still in print, or I'm pretty sure it is. Is the medium tank company still in production as well, or print as well, or at
So
least
yeah,
available in ebook format?
the medium tank company is available right now. I'm just gonna pop the link in the podcast notes there.
Yep, please do.
And that is essentially where people can buy the book right now. The Sturmzug, so the book that we came out with last year, that is still not in public release just yet, simply because we haven't been able to send out all copies, especially the signed copies, because of COVID. It's difficult for me to travel over to Austria right now and sign all the copies, and we don't want to put it into we don't want to put it on the public market until everybody who's actually supported and funded this project these are crowdfunded projects, has actually gotten their copy. So we're waiting until all of those copies are sent out, and then that will also become for a general sale, very much so as the first book from 2019.
Something of interest
excellent.
there regarding the assault platoon thing. I would not be surprised if my father-in-law actually has an original copy of that.
Okay.
I don't know if I mentioned it, but my father-in-law has a extensive collection of military stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There was it was quite funny the first time I actually saw inside his, shall we call it, bunker.
Okay.
He props the door open with a piat.
Topical. Good.
I believe Mags actually saw that.
Yes, I saw the whole thing. He calls it a bunker. Basically, the man has a personal museum.
Yeah, I don't want to give too much away about it.
Let's leave it at that.
Yeah,
it's a personal museum that has some really interesting toys in there. One in particular, which
I was about to
I
mention it.
will mention.
Yeah, the identification.
The flicky. Yes, I didn't realize how terrible my eyes had gotten until I saw this thing. essentially how it works, and I'm sure you've heard of these before, Chris. It's about the size of a deck of cards,
Mm-hmm.
and you put a card inside of it, and it's got a
Yeah.
clicker. And when you hit the clicker, it opens a frame for a split second and closes it. And you've got to
Okay.
look at it and be able to identify what the silhouette of the aircraft is based on that split second. And it's a pilot training
Ah,
tool to be able to
yeah,
to teach pilots to just on an instant glimpse be able to
yeah.
spot what the silhouette of an aircraft is and identify it quickly in combat. I couldn't see them. It was flicking that fast with my eye issue. I couldn't actually see the
Yeah.
silhouettes
That
as they were flicking through.
give yourself some credit. You were getting almost as many as I was.
Oh no, even that's stretching it.
And is that
I need to get one of them.
is that essentially the card you put in there that has the aircraft on, and you
Yeah.
just
So
Yeah,
it's the
go
deck of
yeah, it's got a
cards.
deck of cards.
It has silhouettes of well, when I say deck of cards, it's probably about twice as the deck that's in the particular one we were playing with is probably half again, maybe twice as thick as a regular deck of cards. So I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if there was like 100, 120 cards in there.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's got silhouettes on both sides of each card.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and you pull the deck out, you shuffle them, put them in, snap. Pull the deck out,
Right.
shuffle them, put them in, snap. And it's got allied and enemy aircraft in there, so you got to be able to work out which one is which and just get them straight away. And it was a
Yeah.
requirement to researching them a little bit afterwards. They were actually used for testing, and there was a specific number that you had to be able to get right, and certain aircraft that you had to get every single time
Yeah.
to be approved to actually get flight time. They were you, and I think the decks of cards too. I didn't check which ones I didn't check which ones he had, but I think there were decks of cards that were associated for specific theaters.
Mhm.
So you wouldn't find German aircraft in the Pacific deck, for
Yeah.
example.
Makes sense.
So yeah, it worked for training. But yeah, it was a really interesting little knickknack. I'd heard of them, but I've never seen one before. And he had two of the bloody things in his collection.
yeah,
Huh.
and he also had a few little booklets for um, German booklets for identifying enemy aircraft. I think for ground spotters,
Mhm. Yeah,
and
we
it
had a
had
lot of those.
had various sort of specifications of aircraft that they thought the performance was, which was really
Oh, yeah, yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And he had several of them, and you just go through the dates and see what the
Yeah.
performance they thought the aircraft was at the time. So it was quite interesting to.
That kind of stuff is always fun because I've been going through the German military archive as well, and every now and then you find a file that has exactly that sort of stuff. And it's hilarious to a degree when you see what conclusions these people have initially when new aircraft pop up on the scene. Um, so, for example, yesterday I went through one of the files. It's from 1942, and it's talking about the B-24 apparently making a first appearance somewhere down in Africa. Um, it's caught me by surprise a little bit, but the discussion essentially revolves around what sort of armament the B-24 has, right? And the Germans are saying, well, it's got very heavy defensive armament in the back, and we assume that there is like a double 20 mil in the tail. And then you look at the actual thing, and there is no double 20 mil in the tail, but it's sort of this initial impressions that they have and that are mistaken. And the other thing that I found once, which was really interesting, which I didn't know existed, is a file for recon aircraft, so recon spotters, about identifying enemy tanks. And there's a lot of pictures where obviously you can take a magnifying glass and you can find those tanks, but they're supposed to find those tanks just by dead reckoning with the Mark One eyeball. But then next to those tanks that are being shown on the pictures from, I don't know, 1,000 or 2,000 meters up, 3,000, 6,000 feet, they also had these very early 3D models, printed models. So you have to take those glasses with the red and the blue tint, right?
Yep, to
I
try
don't
and
know.
look 3D. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's literally there's one of those glasses in the file made out of cardboard. You put that on, and then you see the tank. I don't want to say come alive, but you get a basic 3D impression. And I was like, they did that in 1944, really? I was like, okay. And I just went through this
That's actually
file.
really impressive.
yeah, there's like Churchills in there, there's T-34s in there, there's Shermans in there, there's everything the Allies had, down to a half truck, being shown like this. Is this something that was given to every single spotter? I highly doubt it, but it was interesting finding this in the archive.
Mm.
Sp-
Yeah,
sp-
probably done for more for the research side. On this kind of stuff, the one that I've always found interesting, because I'm very, funnily enough, the blind guy, I'm very visually driven. It's why I did the graphic design degree and doing what I'm doing, which we were discussing before, but won't go
Mhm.
into that. But what I actually like is the artist's impressions of pilot descriptions of first encounters of aircraft.
Oh,
So
yes.
they've just come across something they haven't seen before. They've only been able to look at it for a short period of time. They likely haven't engaged it. It's just been spotted at a distance. And then they've got to describe what it looks like. And then you come across the records of what these original artists' renders of what the pilots thought they saw versus
Yeah.
what they actually saw. I do remember seeing one for a Mosquito. It was a very early encounter for a Mosquito. And I think they thought it had 3 engines.
It's possible. I mean, you find these
I'm
mistakes
positive they thought it had a prop hub on the nose as well, and just it didn't look anything like a Mosquito, but that's what it was meant to be. That was the first encounter of a Mosquito that was spotted doing a low altitude run by a pilot, and he gave the
Yeah.
description. And
Yeah, that's the funny aspect. I mean, mostly what they get right is it a radial engine or is it an inline? Because you can quite
mm,
clearly see, is it pointy or is it round?
mm,
But beyond that, yeah, some of those early sort of encounters with aircraft are quite humorous. I mean, there is a book out there that is based on I think a U.S. Identification manual. It's out on print. I think people can even buy it. It's one second. I'm just gonna have to go over to my book rack. There we go. Yeah, it's called Informational Intelligence Summary number 44-32, German Aircraft and Armament. And it's essentially a reprint from 1944 where they show performance data and pictures of various aircraft. And obviously, something like a BF 109F or G or BF 110, they've got some pretty solid data on those things. But
mm,
once you start looking at, for example, the ME 262, the ME 163, and so on and so forth, you start noticing that they don't have that much data and they're just making stuff up to a certain degree. So I'm just on page. Why is this? I'm on the page of the ME 262 right here, and for performance data, they have absolutely nothing. Power plant, they just say 2 jet propulsion units, and then for armament, they say possibly 20 mil. 30 mils, number unknown. That's all they knew about the ME 262 at this point when this was printed, and that shows you, the I don't want to say, obviously this is a very recent aircraft. They don't have that much info on it yet, but it's always interesting seeing sort of the discrepancy between what people thought an aircraft had until they actually engage with it, and then they find an example lying on the ground and can actually analyze it
mm,
over what the reality really is.
mm.
uh, what I want to know is what when you said you were looking in the archives, how does that actually work? How do you get access to the archives? Um, like, do you have to
Um,
apply, or I assume you have to
yes,
make an application and whatnot, and they don't let
yes.
just any old idiot in there. You know, e.g., they'd
Um,
never let me in, but
I'm just posting the link to the book that I just referenced as well there, in case people are interested.
I'm very
So
interested, actually.
the good thing about archives is that they actually do let everyone in to a degree. Um, Archives are essentially nothing but a stockpile of information that is being stored for future reference, right? That's all that archives are. And archives, luckily enough, are also usually, unless they're private archives, which sometimes there's some very good private archives out there as well, but usually have a very open policy of who can come and for what reasons. So if you just want to go to an archive and have a quick gander at a couple of documents, you can theoretically do so. Most of the people that go there obviously go for professional reasons or because they're very, very interested in certain specific aspects of aviation, tanks, history, whatever. As for the actual rules of how you get access, that depends per archive, of course. I can, for example, give you the example here. United Kingdom, we have the National Archives down in Kew. That's essentially still London. And it's a fantastic place. And all you have to do is essentially you make yourself a reader's card, which is essentially just an ID card. You get a reference number. Obviously, you have to give your address. You have to read through a couple of rules. Then you go there. I think you pay £5 for your reader's card, and then you have access to the archive. Now, there are when you're accessing the archive, for example, in Q, once again, there's a couple of checks. So if I go inside the collection, just prior to when I get my documents, which I would have had to order the day before, you will have to go through a security check, for example. And what they do is they take everything you have on hand, and half of the stuff essentially has to go into the locker. And you can only take a laptop with you. You can only take a pencil, not a pen, just a pencil, because they don't want anybody to write into the documents and that being permanent damage, rather than a pencil, which you can theoretically erase. A notebook and a camera. That's all you can take into Q. And even when you bring your laptop, they open up your laptop to see that you're not bringing in documents that you're then putting into files, or if you're exiting, that you're taking documents with you. Because sadly, one of the realities of the situation is that exactly some people are being, let's just say it, dicks, and they steal documents that they then want to sell on eBay or on any other sort of auction website, which is one of the reasons actually why I try to avoid buying documents from those websites, because you never know where they actually came from. And in some of those, you still see it sometimes on Twitter that people peruse eBay and then they suddenly find a file and then they're like, wait a second, that was stolen from this and this archive a couple of years ago. Wow, this is funny. How come this document where you can clearly see the markings of the archive still on the advertised picture being on eBay here? So yeah, there are a couple of security checks depending on the archive. But for the rest,
a recovery? Slight tangent. No, go back to what you're saying, but I'm actually really curious. Is there actually a recovery system in place for those, like a legal avenue to be able to get those back?
I have no
Because that
idea.
really pisses me off.
I would imagine that there is. Obviously, if you see a document like this and you're sure that it came from a archive, and you see sort of maybe on the picture you see references or artifacts from that archive, for example, how the filing system works. I know how the filing system works in Q because I've been there. I know where the hole punches are for the individual files, so I can identify which one comes from there and which one might not have come from there. You can always send it to the archive, that information, and say, hey, here, look at this. This might be documents that were stolen from you. What they are then going to do, I have no idea. I imagine there's some sort of mechanism but trying to identify the exact seller and so on, I'm going to assume that's a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, for the rest, archives are open to everyone. There is no such thing as, oh, you're not a historian, well, then you can't get access. Maybe there are certain more specialized archives that maybe have certain rules and are vetting their we can say clients, but their visitors a little bit more thoroughly. But essentially, the general national archives are open to everyone. The only thing you need to do is invest money, the travel of going there and maybe staying there for a day or two. The bureaucracy, you have to invest time in order to do the application and submit any sort of documents that you might have to submit. And then, of course, there's also the issue of languages. So if you're very interested in, I don't know, German military matters from World War II, and you want to go to the archive in the US, NARA, the National Archives there, or if you want to go to the German military archives in Germany, and you don't speak any German, good luck going through those files. So that's another sort of barrier that you have to bridge. And then beyond that, really going to archives is a question of motivation, because I think a lot of people are very interested in sort of, hey, I want to go to an archive and really get in touch with history. But if they go through the process of sorting and sifting through the files, trying to find exactly what interests them, you're putting a lot of prep time in, and you don't always, especially if you are starting out, you don't know what keywords you have to look for, what sort of document, what the filing system was from the archive, and also at the time what all the abbreviations mean and so on. So you're investing a lot of time finding your files that have absolutely no interest, in a sense, because a lot of files in archives are actually very generic, completely mundane things, like, oh yeah, we need to order like 1,000,000 more screws. You find those files and you're just like, oh, well, that's interesting if you're really interested in the history of screws, but it's probably, for the casual reader, it's probably not that interesting. So I would always say that going to archives is essentially a question of motivation and time rather than anything else.
But on the topic of screws, if you're, for example, trying to look up sort of like trends in government orders and whatnot, or
Yes.
procurement processes, that information would be very interesting to you. So what you find, what you'd call very mundane stuff might be mundane to you, but it might not be mundane to someone else.
Exactly.
It might be incredibly interesting.
Well, to transfer it over to a reference point of the military, like if it's a screw order during a time of war, and you happen to be doing research on military logistics,
Exactly.
what did they need these for? Why did they need these many of them? And how were they moving them around? It suddenly becomes fairly pertinent. So, all important information to be carried. But it is probably the least exciting stuff, especially if you're dealing with more combat vehicles, as you're doing with your books.
Yeah.
Now, on the books, I do have to ask the question. I did warn you I was going to have a question that I've been wanting to ask you for
Yes.
ages
Please put
before,
me on the spot.
and it's
Go ahead.
well, it's actually a really simple one. We have Medium Tank Company. Okay,
Yes.
that's your first book. Second one, Assault Platoon, so infantry.
Yes.
Your military aviation history.
Yes.
Where's the planes?
Well, that's actually that's a perfect question, because that was the announcement that I was, sort of prepping here for as well. So it is, we did a book in 2019, we did the book in 2020, so naturally we're planning a book for 2021 as well. And since we have done tanks, since we have done infantry, and since neither Bernhard or I are particularly knowledgeable about not planes, ships, obviously the next step would probably be something on planes, right? So yes, what we are looking forward to in 2021 is essentially having the third book in the series, and that is going to have a aviation spin to it, definitely. And I think this is the first time I'm actually publicly announcing this as well. So there you go.
Nice. We get
Do you have?
Yeah.
Nice. Do you have a? I assume you've probably got an aircraft in mind, and you're probably not going to announce it yet.
No, but I can say it's a very well-known German aircraft that, in my opinion, and I'm also writing a conference paper on this at the moment, which is why these two projects go very well hand in hand, is, in my opinion, very much misunderstood. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Well, hey, that's more than I was going to ask. I was actually going to wonder if you would narrow it down to a nation for me. We've got Germany, so it will be a German aircraft. Thank you.
Yes.
Well,
Although that makes sense for the sequence of books, but you have access to the obviously the British archives, so there is nothing stopping you from going out and looking at some of their stuff from the other side as well. So,
which is actually also something I'm doing in this book. So yes, it is going to be a German plane, simply because I think what Bernhard and I can bring to the table is we are both German speakers, native German speakers. We have a relatively good degree or knowledge of the English language, and we're doing those translations, and we're bringing sort of these primary documents that were written in German into the English language. And I think we're doing a relatively good job with that. And that's sort of the formula that we want to follow, because anybody can go through anybody who speaks English can go through all the English files, but there are less people out there, I think, who understand or speak German to the degree where you actually can go through those files, those original files.
Yeah, I'd just like to
Yeah.
point out.
Actually,
Wait a minute, Max. I'd just like to point out that your English skills are better than mine.
Well,
to be
theoretically,
fair,
maybe. I mean,
Also,
well,
no,
also,
no,
also,
no,
your
no. To be
grasp
fair, they're
on
probably better than
US
most
culture is a
Australians.
lot stronger than mine too.
I don't know. There's many moments where I'm just sitting there, speaking English, and I'm just thinking to myself, what is the word? What is the word? What is the word? And then I just use the most simplest word that pops into my head. But funnily enough, I'm starting to have the same issue with German sometimes when I speak German. So, switching between the two languages is fun. It's very fun.
I was actually just going to expand before on the books themselves. You were talking about
Mm,
doing the references between translation from German over to English. I just want to
yeah,
point out to everybody here, and I'll try and grab a snapshot of a few examples of this as well, and see if we can get them popped up. But what Chris is actually referring to in here is what you've got is the German manual, and then you've got the English translation that you've already done. But because there is a little bit of a language transfer barrier between the two, you also have annotations and notes going through the entirety of these books,
yes,
clarifying anything that might be a little bit like not translate nice and clean in order to make it easier to follow through and understand where the German manual is trying to go in certain
yeah.
things. There was one, and I'm actually trying to find the page. I was going to go through and bookmark these, but I didn't get back from my trip to Melbourne quite fast enough. But there was one that was in Medium Tank Company where it was describing. It was an annotation you had to put in to explain an instruction that was given to medium tank drivers when
Mm-hmm.
it come to encountering enemy troops or just in general, let's call them soft targets that
Yeah.
you may encounter that may not want to get away from the tank. And it was a rather dark description that had to in German it was quite clean and understandable, but the actual translation when it come over to image come across English come across as quite dark
Is that
as
the
a
one where the driver is essentially instructed to run over tank guns and infantry and so on? Is
yes, and
that the one?
anything else that happens to get in the
Yeah,
way that won't
yeah,
clog up the treads.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there's just little annotations like that to try and describe concepts that. Well, there is. I imagine the way it was written out that there was actually a term for it in German that just doesn't exist in English.
Yeah, well,
There's
So,
many of
German.
those terms.
Yeah,
mhm.
Germans tend to string several thousand words together in a hundreds of letters
Yeah.
long word and say that that's a perfect thing to do.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we are. I think it's called a compound language, like where we construct words out of different words. Um, and this does present one of the biggest challenges that we have with the book is because a lot of the stuff that sounds very clean in German is extremely difficult to translate into English because a lot of English words have I would even say a certain ambiguity to them, right?
Mhm.
Because we also have this when we discuss this with some of the experts that we're passing some of these translations by. So for the Medium Tank Company, we had Nicholas the Chieftain Moran, who's been an invaluable source in trying to get this into proper current current English, current U.S. Army English. And we've been saying like, okay, so this sentence explains essentially this specifically, and he says, well, if you want to translate that into English, this would be the easiest way of doing that. And then we'll look at that sentence and we're like, well, that's very ambiguous because it's not as specific as the German, right? And the same thing we had with the Sturmzug, where we had somebody over in the US as well who's I believe he's even active service, a rifleman, and he gave us a lot of valuable feedback. But every now and then we were sitting there like, okay, we understand why the English language tries to explain it this way, and that is really the most straightforward way, but it's not specific enough. And then we have to construct the translation in such a way that it is both specific but still readable to
Hmm.
you know per, to somebody who's an English native speaker, and that then results sometimes in these sentences that are a little bit I would even say clumsy, but they are designed in such a way that there is the least amount of ambiguity to them. And then on top of that, there is other issues. So with the medium tank company, for example, Bernhard, and he's really the one you should be talking about this specifically because he did the work on this together with the chieftain. There are certain terms that change their meaning over time, right? So there's one issue where the German translation already uses words that we don't use in German anymore, and we're just sitting there like, what does this word mean? And then we have to figure that out. That happens once or twice a book. And then there is the thing with, for example, in German, we have Entfaltung and Entwicklung. And Entfaltung and Entwicklung essentially happens when a tank unit drops out of the column and spreads out into what you could basically describe as combat formation, right? And Entfaltung happens first. And that is just breaking up the big column into individual chunks. And then you have Entwicklung, where these individual chunks are then split up into individual units again. Very simplified explanation here. In the US translation, it's essentially just both of these Entfaltung and Entwicklung are just deployment. Yeah, the unit deploys from the column into, I don't know, combat formation, whatever. And then once you have such a problem, Bernhard was chatting with the chieftain. Okay, how do we translate this specifically into English in order to make this clear? And I've added a whole, like in the glossary, we've added a whole explanation on this issue as well, because I believe that was also one of those things where the meaning in English changed between World War II and now. So the U.S. Army, the way they, I believe, used the word deployment back then to the way they use it now is completely different. But you'll have to chat with Bernhard on that because he was sort of the expert on that specific segment.
Yeah, I'll make sure I definitely do. But just what you're describing there, it's amazing you guys are actually managing to get a single book out a year, like at that kind of a rate, one every year, because you're doing not only just a straight German to English translation, but then trying to go through and work out how to explain words and subjects that just aren't in use anymore or just don't exist within the language anymore, or straight terms that just don't go through. That's a load of information to go through and to be able to process and produce a book in a 12-month period. And you're both maintaining active YouTube channels at exactly the same time as well. I mean, I'm bloody impressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, I would say actually one of the good things about the books, the way that we're working them is that there's always one of us who's shall I say, a little bit ignorant about the topic. And that's actually a strength. And I want to explain that specifically here because otherwise it might sound a bit strange. Bernhard, he's sort of the tanks guy. He's the person who really looks at what is happening on the ground. I'm the aircraft guy, right? I have certain knowledge about the German Wehrmacht as a whole. So you have the Heer, which is the army, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and of course the Kriegsmarine. And he has the same. But we have, in those silos, I'm specialized on the Luftwaffe and he's specialized on the Heer. So when he sends me his first draft translation on, let's say, the Panzerkompanie, I go through it, and stuff that sounds right for him because he's in the topic might not sound right to me because I'm not that deeply invested in the topic, and I might be coming at this almost as a reader. And then I can turn around and tell him, look, I think I understand what you're trying to say here, but this sounds very confusing if you do not have previous knowledge of certain aspects or certain elements or certain doctrinal developments within the German army. So why don't we put a footnote here explaining that thing? Or why don't we try to rephrase the sentence in such a way that it's going to be beneficial to the reader? And the same thing I imagine is going to happen with the next project, which is already in the works, where I send out my preliminary draft to him, and he bounces that back to me and says, like, okay, so and I imagine this is how it's going to go. Like, I can see how this makes sense to somebody who's very much interested in aircraft and who knows the Luftwaffe, but the general reader might not be invested that much, and this needs more explanation, and other aspects are fine. So I think in that sense is a little bit of ignorance of the topic. Obviously, the more I mean, I've gone through this medium tank company book. I think it has gone through like 30 to 40 revisions. The same thing with the Sturmzug. I mean, the medium tanks were essentially rolling out of my ears at that point. It was up to here. So in that sense, you get really knowledgeable about that specific subject. But coming at it from almost the position of a reader, I think helps in a sense that you have both an expert working on this and somebody who is interested in the subject, but who and interested in the period, but whose expertise lies slightly outside of that specific silo.
Yeah, no, I can see exactly how that works. Much smaller scale, but on some of the stuff that I do on YouTube,
Mm,
and obviously slightly different shift on it. Just trying to explain to people why I do certain maneuvers or certain things while I'm actually in combat.
yeah.
I do a maneuver and I don't even think about it while I'm flying, and then I've got to try and explain to somebody who isn't aware of why I would do such a thing,
Hmm.
why that actually works.
Yeah.
It can be frustrating if you ever if you ever actually have a moment and forget that the person you're often talking to will have no idea how to even perform a maneuver, like perform a set maneuver. Like something as simple as a barrel roll can really
Yeah.
confuse people, and why and what circumstances you would actually use it in. So often having either taking the time yourself to stop and think about, okay, the person on the other end may not even understand where why this exists in the first place or where it comes from, and or having somebody to bounce it off that is in that position or only has some information to give you an reflect point and actually improve it. I can see exactly how that would work.
See,
Yeah.
Um,
I can
I'm
explain.
obviously
I can easily explain pretty much any maneuver I pull in anything IL2 under DCS. It's a simple case of because I'm an idiot.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially exactly the issue. Like, how do you how do you keep a certain amount of information and depth to whatever you're doing while breaking it down to somebody who has not built up the basic of where you're standing, and explain it to them. I mean, the easiest analogy I have here is that when I was in high school, I was absolutely in love with chemistry. That was the class that I really wanted to go to every single day. I was studying chemistry more than anything. I always did my chemistry homework. Other homeworks less so. And then the teacher changed in my school. And the new teacher that we had, the old teacher was extremely good in breaking the subject down and explaining it and really making me enthusiastic about it. And then the new teacher came out and who was probably even a better chemist from his own professional credentials, but he just couldn't explain it properly. And my interest for chemistry just completely went out of the window, which is why I'm now, in love with aircraft for some reason. But you sometimes run into these issues where it's like you understand what is going on, and essentially also the amount of research you have done on about a certain topic makes you understand how convoluted and how difficult and how utterly like confusing it is, really. And you see all the limitations, you see all the lacks in your own knowledge, and then you try to break something down to somebody while still trying to keep everything correct, although simplified. It's incredibly challenging. Yeah.
It's the problem with the massive information. You
Yeah.
Once you know enough about a subject, how it works, the mechanics that are behind it, the physics that are behind it, everything that makes it function. Now you've got to try and explain it to somebody who has absolutely zero understanding of any of it. At
Yeah.
what point do you start? Where do you
Exactly.
actually begin that breakdown? Like what part? And yeah, I'm working
Yeah.
on something at the moment, which is why I bring it up. But yeah, I'm struggling with that myself at the moment. Exactly where do I begin? Uh, too many requests for air combat maneuver videos and
Mm.
tutorials. So exactly where do I begin?
The the best thing that I always found is you try to find the one thing that the majority of people can sort of agree about. You give somebody a something that they can hold on to, and it's like, okay, so we are saying that um let's I'm going to try to make something out of my head here with air combat, right? let's just say that the A6M0 is a good turn fighter, right?
Mhm.
So we have that basis. People know, okay, the Zero is a good turn fighter. And then you can expand from that. Okay, so that means that if I take somebody into a fight, I'm going to try to get him to operate on the horizontal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to do the same thing. I mean, even with a Zero, I can go into the vertical if I want to, right? But you try to break that down and you give people sort of a basic understanding of, okay, this is something let's try, or let's see how we can use that, what and then explore where that works out and what the limitations are, and then we build from there. So first we take the Zero into the horizontal. You're going to beat everyone. Now let's try to take it into the vertical, and see what happens then. You're going to be able to beat everyone as well, as long as they stay in the horizontal. But what's going to happen once you meet somebody in an aircraft that is very good in the vertical as well? How do you counter that? And I think at that point you go away from this sort of, especially with the Zero, from this one trick pony thing. I think that's the saying, right?
Yep,
And
that's the one.
you're trying to you're trying to explore more options that are open to you.
Mm.
So it's always good, I think, to just have that one thing that everybody can agree on, and then just go from there. I hope that makes
So
sense.
Dead Meat's is putting up a 0 at the moment. No, that makes complete sense. It's similar to where I was going from, although guys, I've got a little bit of a new style going on at the moment. I'm sort of trying to start from the whole dying is bad, so let's not do that, and this is how not to.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, it's the issue that I'm running into, and again, it's sort of just a light expanse on the complexities that you're obviously dealing with writing the books. But whenever you're dealing with a subject like that, it gets exponentially more complicated the further on you go. So the discussion
Mhm.
just then we were having with just the Zero. So that's just the Zero.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're just going to have, all right, let's have the Zero just fight something that the Zero fought. Fairly common. Okay. Zero fighting an F6Fs. All right. So now we've got two aircraft that are involved here. So what would you do in what situations between the two? A little bit more complicated because now you've got to include what the F6F does.
Yeah.
But now there's a P-38 in the area.
Yeah.
So now you're having to deal with three aircraft of three different types. And at this point, we're only dealing with a dogfight. But what if that Zero is actually, what if you're trying to achieve something that isn't necessarily just dogfighting?
Mhm.
So you're not just trying to engage targets now. You have to have to disengage or have to complete, say, an escort job against another aircraft. So now you've got multiple aircraft involved, and your objective isn't necessarily to just shoot these planes down. It's to
Yeah.
shoot these planes down while simultaneously keeping them away from something else. And the more you add to it, and when you think about it, what the aircraft actually does in real life, this is really easy. This is what they did. There is whole
Yeah.
stories, pilot descriptions, entire movies based around what these things do. But when you actually break down the mechanics behind how to fly them and what information you need to track, you start sounding like you're trying to describe the pilots in these aircraft as people that have three heads, 360-degree vision, inbuilt radar, and reflexes that are beyond human comprehension in order to be able to keep track of everything that they're doing and be able to keep the aircraft in some way. And I forget his name now, the Japanese ace. But he, what's his name? And it's completely eluded me. As one of Japan's top aces, he's got a whole bunch of his memoirs written out and different engagements he had. And it starts reading like this is just Japanese Superman right now. He's Japanese
Oh, is
Superman and he
this
uses a Zero to
Saburo
fly.
Sakai, Samurai?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Sakai. And it's just it's Japanese Superman and he flies in a
Yeah.
goddamn Zero rather than with a cape.
The
It's
the important I mean, the thing is with Saburo Sakai's book is, at least I've heard it. I have not read the original Japanese book because sadly I don't speak Japanese. But what I've heard is that the English translation does have some um,
Creative lift.
exaggeration. Yeah.
yeah,
It's exaggerating certain things, but I'm especially when I think in his book he also explains his training, right, and sort of the things he had to do in his training and how they were weeding out pilots. I mean, yeah, you do get an impression that they were reading the force of the best ones, but at the same time, I mean, what I'm reading about a lot of pilots is, especially in their early engagements, they're just saying like, it's so confusing. I don't know what's going on. I'm just trying to stay with my leader and um, get a couple of shots into somebody, and then just suddenly the dogfight is over, and that's it. I mean, that's the thing. One of the most consistent things I read about these mission reports is that the engagements, they come and go, and they're quickly done. They're just done.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, we met a couple of Spitfires, or we met a couple of Lavochkins, had a fight. I shot at something. I think I got it. I went home. It's just like,
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
that's the one thing that Hollywood really does confuse a lot of people about, and
yes,
I've spent a bit of time trying to explain things as well, explain this to people over the years as well. In real life, um, air-to-air engagements and combat are below 2 minutes usually.
yeah,
It wasn't common to go much longer than that. Even on the big attacks against like B-17s, German fighters would come in, they'd pop their shots, they'd roll out, they'd drop altitude during the rollout, trying not to get plugged by 50 cals. They wouldn't come back around. The next
yeah,
squadron would have a swing at them, but they'd go
yeah,
home.
yeah,
They were done. The entire engagement, 30 seconds. Dive in, pull trigger, get out, hope you don't get shot, and hope your bullets or your shells hit something in the process. Go
yeah.
home. You're done.
That
So,
makes sense. Also, if
mm,
you read those reports, it makes perfect sense, right? Because um, now talking about the B-17s, I made a video about this, I think last December, where I go through some of the early experience and sort of the planning and the experience reports about how to fight B-17s. And
mm,
the German fights, and this is out of multiple squadrons, are saying essentially all we can do is get one good pass. And we
mm,
need to make sure that we do one good pass on one single group of bombers, most likely four, flying into in a formation. And if we can, we loop around, and together as a Schwarm or a Rotte, we hit another group, and then we're out. Like,
mm,
you don't have more time, because of course you're being vectored in, and you have to attack the formation from the position that you are being led. I mean, there's obviously on the ground there's radar and so on, and guiding you to the formation, and they're guiding you there, and then you take what you can, because you're not going to have time to get the most optimal approach. You just
mm,
attack. If you can, you loop around, attack a second group, and that's you done. By now the
mm,
formation has already moved on, and there's so many planes in the air, and there's so many escorts as well. It gets utterly confusing. And the other thing is, um, sometimes it's not even about picking a fight. Sometimes, especially what you were saying about escorting, it's just about trying to stop people from attacking your own planes. And if you shoot them down, great. If not, doesn't matter, as long as you keep them from attacking your own guys. Justin Pike, he's a really good. He's very knowledgeable about sort of Japanese Navy and Japanese Army aviation in the South Pacific and then the Pacific. He recently told me about these engagements where the Zeros were escorting, I think, Betty bombers, striking some British installations, I think 1942, somewhere in the South Pacific, or 1943 was it perhaps. Anyway, they ran into British fighters, and instead of picking a fight with them, they just ran away, and the British fighters tried to keep up with them. They did keep up with them, but not in gun distance.
mm,
And then the Zeros just outran them on pure fuel, and the Brits had to turn back, but they know at the moment they turn back, the Zeros can loop around and attack them from behind again. So
mm,
sometimes you get these really weird situations where you don't even need to pick a fight, and you just wait until the enemy has to essentially do a mistake, because in the Zero you've got all that range, you've got all that fuel, and in the Spitfire, I think it was Spitfires back then,
mm,
the specific engagement he recounted to me, you don't have that.
mm. Yeah, Spitfires were very much the interceptor of their time. The long legs
Absolutely.
was not one of the things that they
Yeah.
absolutely had. Incredible aircraft, but
Yeah.
where Zeros, people give them a lot of shit. But in the earlier stages of the war, they were faster than almost everything else that was in the sky,
Yeah.
and their range was almost uncounterable.
Yeah.
It was the advantage of having virtually no protection inside of the aircraft, or any excess weight that wasn't 100% required for the flight capability or the fight capability of the aircraft, essentially removed.
Interestingly enough, that the range of the Japanese planes, especially the Betty bombers and the Zeros, that had a negative result as well. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't really appreciate enough. Is if you have all that range, you're less inclined to build aerodromes,
Mm,
because you can already cover all that space. And the Japanese specifically, I mean, they didn't especially if you compare them to the Allies in the South Pacific. They certainly did not do a good job with aerodrome construction and also defense. But I mean, just look up WIWAC in Hollandia. What happened there? I mean, it's like the same trick twice, and you essentially knock out the whole Japanese air power in the region within one single mission, just because they didn't space out the aircraft and because they didn't build the bloody aerodrome properly. But if you have all that range, you can already cover all that mileage, and you can just say, okay, we're going to base our zeros in Rerbul, and that's good enough. And of course, you have all these pilots flying hundreds, thousands of miles, one mission a day, just completely tiring themselves out.
Yeah. Yeah, there was definitely some negatives in there. The Allied, or in particular the American way of if the island's big enough for a runway, put a runway on it. Actually,
Exactly.
was definitely a superior way of doing things. I mean, that's largely why the Japanese never managed to take Port Moresby.
Mm.
The 40 days with Australians in clapped out P40s defending essentially Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
That's why Japan couldn't actually take them. They could get within range. They could strike. I'm pretty sure it was actually Saki that did the air show over the RAAF airbase
Mm-hmm.
after an engagement, and they sent a message back to him. Politely telling him that they appreciated the base commander sent a message back to the Japanese aerodrome that he came from with I think it was a bottle of champagne and a note attached to it that they dropped out on a small parachute into the airbase. It basically said, "We really appreciated the air show over our airfields. Come back again, and we'll
Oh yeah,
shoot
I
you the shit
remember
down."
this. Yeah, I can't remember which pilot it was, but yeah, it was also one of those aces
Yeah, it
that
was one of
Japan.
those top aces. It might have been him, but it would suit him. But it was definitely one of the aces. And yeah, it was basically yeah. We liked the air show. It was really impressive. Come back and we'll kill you. But yeah, that was why we managed to do that defense. Our P40s were knackered. Our pilots all had dysentery and infections and injuries. They were flying with broken legs because we weren't getting spare pilots in. They
Yeah.
were fixing the P40s by doing engine repairs, by rolling them under trees and using trees to lever the engines out of the aircraft in order to fix them, and then dropping them back in. There were parts of the aircraft that were held together literally by like fencing wire. They just
Mm.
fencing wire tied in parts of the components of the aircraft because that's all they had, and they had to keep fighting.
Yeah.
And we managed to hold them off, and that was the only thing. If they had a base that was closer, yeah, we would have lost that. We would have got walked over. But it was just the pilots by the time they actually got to the area that we were defending, or I forget which squadron it is now. I'd have to dig up exactly what squadron it is. But yeah, by the time they actually got out there, the pilots are half knackered.
Yeah.
Just on the distances they had to cover.
Yeah, definitely. Of
Yeah.
course, also with the attack on Port Moresby and the whole New Guinea operation, it is a very fast campaign early on,
Mm.
and I think the Japanese, they did build an aerodrome at Lae and Salamaua, if I remember correctly, and I think there was one more in the region, but I don't believe they actually had enough manpower early on to really build up those aerodromes in such a way that they could hold a whole strike force. I believe when
I
IE and Salamaua get hit by the US Navy, I think there's like 4 or 5 zeros that are supposed to come into the region, but they're not there yet or something. And that was literally just to cover the landing zone.
Yeah, I can't remember what base it was. It was one of the smaller ones that Japan was trying to establish at the time. Again, this would have to be go back into my research files to find it, but it was the reason why I remember this is was an inscription from an Australian Beaufighter attack, and we had known about the airbase for about 2 weeks.
Hmm.
And even after have been established and there for 2 weeks, the forces there were that low that 6 Beaufighters loaded with rockets did a strike on the airfield and took out all of the active aircraft that were recorded as being stationed there and all of the buildings and support structures in a single pass.
Mm.
They just tore the base apart in one swing. They built a base and they just didn't put enough there. They didn't expand it. It didn't have enough defenses. They didn't get enough aircraft in, and so we tore it in half and then flew away.
Yeah, that's
And
that's one of
then
the things that the Japanese did rather poorly in the area. It's early warning,
Mm.
first of all. The Allies did a lot better early warning, which is massive. The advantage early warning gives is you really cannot quantify it and qualify it, because it's such a massive difference of getting your planes into the air on time, getting all your A gunners set up, spacing out the aircraft in time, and so on and so forth. But one of the things they also, like you said, I mean, basic aerodrome construction, it's always, or it seems to me at least, as a more casual glance, it always seemed to be a very straightforward, this is the airstrip. The aircraft are settled around. There's not really revetments. There's no really protection. There's no really spacing out these planes. And then obviously you come in with something like Beaufighters or B-25s with a couple of parafrags on them, and you just have one run over the airfield, and that's it. And that's WIVAC
and you take
Hollandia
them
in a
off.
nutshell. And
Yeah.
you lose your all air power in the region because you didn't space out your aircraft, you didn't space out your airfield, you didn't build up enough construction, you don't have an early warning system, and the cap that you put into the air that flies around the whole time is not really strong enough to really hold up a full force of B-25s and we're coming in with escorts. It's just not.
For those in the chat that are interested in the events around like Australia's defence, Port Moresby and Papua New Guinea, the book that I was trying to remember the name of before, it's called The 44 Days. 75 Squadron was the squadron that was on station, and by Michael Viech. So 44 Days, 70. Hang on, I'm trying to pull up the whole name here at the moment, and my internet is being slow. What are you doing? Stop that. It's not going to pop it up for me. Yeah, the 44 days, 75 Squadron, and I can't see the rest of it because my internet is being terrible. If you search that, you'll be able to pop it up. It's Michael Viech, and now it's playing in my ear because I've got the audiobook version of it as well.
Right.
Fantastic one to check out if you're curious about that particular thing. The situation that they had to fight from them was kind of terrible. Anyways, moving on. Other things. Oh, hang on.
Before
Go,
you
Debbie.
jump in, Chris. Now I know I did ask you this in a DM, but I'd just like to ask it in a more public setting. There's a winged vehicle up on the stream at the moment. I'm just wondering when the in the cockpit for this vehicle is coming.
Inside the cockpit for this vehicle, that's going to be still some time. So I'm not even I think there are 2 or 3 on display in Europe, and I don't exactly know. I mean, there is a manned version of this, right? In the
I'm
Australian War
aware of it.
Memorial,
No, the one
is
in
in
the War Memorial, which is the one on the screen, is
yeah.
the unmanned version. I'm not sure
Okay,
if
it's the
that's an
unmanned. So
original or a replica. I'm not entirely
yeah.
sure.
So they have one, I know, in the Imperial War Museum. But the manned version of that, I think there are 4 or 5 on public display in various museums.
They made that many?
But they made they made a surprising number of them, if I remember correctly. But they barely, I don't think they ever used them operationally. I mean, you have to look essentially for the Fiesler Reichenbach. Yeah, or just type in manned V1, I guess, in Google. I think that works. But I think they built close to 200 or something, I want to say. Yes, there is a V1. Somebody in the chat is just saying that in Berlin Ghetto, yes, but it's hanging from the ceiling as well. For some reason, V1s are always hanging from the ceiling. Obviously, also for the manned version, I'm not quite sure. It's always a question of also, can you get access to something that is relatively rare, and there's conservational issues and so on and so forth. Plus, I mean, I got to be honest, it's not on top of my priority list because yes, it's something that a lot of people for some reason get excited about, these late war German stuff, even if they didn't fly that much or weren't used that much. But personally, I think there's a lot of other planes,
But far more interesting.
German and non-German, who I would prefer to do first because they saw actual service during the war.
You mean like the plane that I've just put up on stream now?
The ME-163, that would be interesting, I think, because there's a lot of stories that could be told about this aircraft. But again, one of those planes that I quite honestly do not understand what the fuss is about. because their impact in the war was essentially zero, except for draining German resources and time. But it's obviously there's a lot of interesting stories that can be told about that aircraft, both from a development perspective. Also, how did the aircraft actually start out, and how was it developed to production, or being essentially a labor of slave labor, and so on and so forth. So,
Yeah.
lots of things that you could potentially talk about.
I would really be interested in finding out exactly how did you convince somebody to get in one of those things to begin with. I mean, when you see how they're fueled up, and the pilots would have seen how they're fueled up and would have known why they were fueled up that way. How the hell do you get somebody to actually go, you know what, this is a really good idea. I'm going to jump in this thing and I'm going to fly it at something that's going to shoot at me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always difficult from being in the 21st century, of trying to place yourself into the mind of somebody in 1944 who's German, and
Mm.
trying to understand why he would jump into one of these machines. I think there's always going to be a mixture of duty, certain fanaticism perhaps on the account of some people, and
Mm.
also being, back then, I think people considered risks differently. First of all, you're in a war, so you know that people are dying left, right, and center, and maybe that changes your perspective on the whole issue of personal safety. And I think back then, generally speaking, I mean, even in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and if you look at the sort of the what we nowadays would describe as health and safety, um, people were just not acting and living that safe as we do nowadays. So everything is relative in that sense, I guess. And
Americans
for
sticking
the
warning
German side,
labels on everything.
exactly. I mean, we live in a society where the priority is always warning people about the dangers of everything and limiting the dangers of everything, which is commendable. But you have to think back about how it was back then, and I think people put different amounts of were weighing their chances, or weighing the risks completely differently, especially if you're in a total war situation. And for the Germans, a lot of they actually had a lot of problems trying to find volunteers for this sort of stuff. There
I
were,
can understand that.
yeah. Even we talk about German being very fanatical about Nazi Germany and so on, and that was the case with, I think, a lot more than we give, especially within the Luftwaffe, a lot more than we give credit to. The Luftwaffe has this reputation of being sort of uh, the least nationalistically induced force, which I think is not correct. But I'm gonna have to wait for until Victoria Taylor's PhD comes out, because that's literally our topic about that. But yeah, even then they were finding very few uh volunteers and trying to fly these planes. And even when they found the volunteers, this is the other thing, there were a lot of people that said, actually, this is not worth it. This is just silly. Why are we sending 5 or 6 people up in planes just to ram enemy aircraft, when really what we should be doing is training these people so they can shoot down multiple aircraft instead of just ramming down one. um
Yeah.
but it's a massive topic. It goes into all sorts of things, of political ideology over to what people's feeling were at the time.
Mm. Well, yeah, it's definitely something that I can, I can partially understand that, but at the same time, I can visualize in World War II in Germany, somebody getting into a 109, even though it's even later war when they weren't the best machines around and there was a high risk involved. I can see that. I can definitely
Yeah.
see somebody getting into a Focke-Wulf 190. I can understand getting into the bombers, the 262. I can completely understand, but I've never been able to wrap my head around somebody thinking it was a good idea to get into an armed fuel air bomb and then flying it at somebody who's going to shoot you would probably cause you to detonate mid-flight. That's if you don't explode taking off, and then you have the chance of exploding on landing as well.
Yeah.
I've just never. There is no way they couldn't have known, and it's just that particular aircraft. I've never been able to wrap my head around that. Anything else, yeah, I get that. I can
Mm.
get other aircraft. Just that the 163 confuses the hell out of me. I just don't get it.
Well,
But on the subject of specific aircraft and cockpits, your series inside the cockpit, I have been curious. How exactly do you go about setting up for one of those?
Uh, yeah. Well, I haven't been able to do anything for over a year now with COVID, obviously. But how do you set up an inside the cockpit? A good question. First of all, it's a mixture of logistics and access, right? So, can I get to a museum and then can I spend a certain amount of time there in order to actually film the aircraft that I want to film there? That's question number one. Second question is, does the museum allow me to get to get close to these aircraft and get access? Yeah. If I answer the first question with yes, I can get there and I have the time and the funds and the means to do this, then obviously I get in touch with the museum and then I ask them, can I do this? And that then really depends on the museums. Generally speaking, museums are relatively open to it, considering that I already have a volume of work that I can present to them and
Mm,
say, "Hey, this is what I do. Can I do the same in your place?" And then it's obviously a little bit of a I wouldn't even call it a negotiation. Usually it's a very casual chat of course, these aircraft are possible, these aircraft are not possible, this aircraft is possible with the cockpit, this aircraft is possible without the cockpit. And this is a question of what is the state of the aircraft? What is
mm,
the uniqueness of the aircraft? What is how can I even access the aircraft to begin with? Is it hanging from the ceiling? Is it standing on the ground? Is it on stilts? And all of those sort of questions need to be answered before I can actually go there. And then, of course, it's once I go there, I've done my research about these aircraft. Um, I film, and that's the easy part. The going there, filming. That's the part, the easy part. I get be close to these aircraft. I can sit in some of them. Dream come true. But on that's the stuff that you sort of see on YouTube. What you do not see on YouTube is the prepping time, the logistics, the money that's involved in getting to these places. Booking hotels, staying over there for a couple of days. Because what you got to remember is an inside the cockpit episode is usually between 20 to 30 minutes long. It
mm,
is 3 hours filming time at the museum for one aircraft with the cockpit if everything goes well. That
mm,
means that in a normal working day, I can get about 3 to 4 aircraft done. But if I go to a museum and if I spend, of course, the money and the finances to go there, just going for one day often usually doesn't make any sense, right? I have to go for multiple days,
mm.
and it's a massive logistical issue and challenge. And plus, you're reliant on the museum, of course, being open to this, being a larger project. And thankfully, a lot of museums are very, I was on all the museums that I've worked with so far. Were absolutely lovely people, very helpful, very knowledgeable, more than happy to make things happen.
and it's
And
good
also the museums
advertising for them as well.
it is fantastic advertisement for them, and I know from quite a few museums that they've been saying, also from people that I meet there who make the rounds, who are guides and so on, that people come up and say, hey, I've seen this in a YouTube video, that's why I wanted to come by and see it for myself. Um,
Yeah, well, the main reason I was actually asking on your end is I was looking at actually starting to do a limited number of something very similar in
mhm,
2019 before the dreaded COVID actually hit because uh, I've mentioned this a few times before, so I don't think it's anything really that I can't throw out on a podcast. My father is ex-RAAF. His last
yeah,
posting was actually at Point Cook RAAF Museum. He
mhm,
got some very interesting qualifications on the side that made him able to do things like such as actually doing proper airworthy rated coatings for World War One aircraft, doing proper
okay,
canvas stretching, resin coating, and
yeah,
working with wood internals, rebuilding certain aspects. And one of his final jobs was actually completely rebuilding from the ground up the airframe of the RAAF's P-51D.
yeah,
And via him, the curator that he worked under at the time, who was working on the RAAF museum when that was still actually a base, is still the curator that's there now, all these years
mhm,
later. I actually went down for my Bucks night. Dead Meat came down with me. My Bucks night was actually in the aircraft maintenance hangar before we went on and got on the piss like you would. Um, checking out the Mosquito they're in the process of building down there at the moment, and looking at them basically in the halfway through the process of gutting a P-51. But
Yeah.
I've I've never taken it that step further, and there is some interesting stuff down there. So I was kind of interested in how you actually set it up. And the second question was going to be: have you looked at doing anything overseas?
Yes.
Because I know you have
Well,
to travel a little bit, getting into some of the other
well,
hangars.
technically, he has done a few overseas since. Well, he's. Do you mind me mentioning where you're based? There?
I'm based in London, United Kingdom. That's
Cool.
fine.
I didn't know whether I could say that or not. So, and you've obviously gone overseas to Europe, multiple places in Europe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. I mean, I have thought about and I've started planning about this. Just like with the limited series that you were planning. COVID took a massive hit.
Mm,
In terms of inside the cockpit. I was lucky enough to have a certain amount of footage that was pre-filmed and that was essentially in the back catalog, just waiting to be published. But by now, yeah, I mean, we're all fighting with COVID a year later down the line, and the situation is still not improving that much, at least over here in Europe at the time of the recording here. Um, but the good thing about Europe is that everything is relatively compact and you can get to places under normal circumstances relatively easily. But there were about 4 to 5 museum trips that had to be postponed in 2020 that are hopefully going to happen in 2021. Although, again, with the situation, we'll have to see what happens. There is also the planning of having more substantial trips, not going from one continent to the other and staying in a certain place for maybe 2 to 3 months and filming a couple of museums there and just trying to get as much done as possible. But that would involve a lot of planning, a lot of logistics, and the other thing, of course, the limitation. And I've mentioned this before, but it is quite a drastic limitation. It's you need to have the funding. You
mm,
need to have the money to get to these places and to fund the trip. And yeah, this inside the cockpit is something that is essentially funded by Patreon supporters, and
mm.
that gives a certain actually that gives complete freedom within the means that are available.
So, speaking of Patreon, where would if people would like to help fund these trips, how would they find your Patreon?
Same way as you would find my YouTube channel, I guess. Just type in military aviation history, and you find it in the description on my videos. And if you type Patreon into Google, I imagine you would find that as well. I can give you the link now, but I'm pretty sure people can find it.
That's
That
right. I will
should
grab
be.
it later, and I'll make sure that's listed down underneath, along with links to both of your. Well, at the moment, one of your books that's on sale, and
Yeah,
a place where they will hopefully be able to find the second one when it becomes available.
awesome. Thanks very much.
So we're gonna have to wind it up. We're getting close to an hour and a half now. Um,
Hmm.
so now just a couple of quick questions before we wind it up, though. First one about the in the cockpit series you've made.
Yeah.
What's been your favorite one to do so far? Which aircraft did you enjoy the most?
Oh, you were hoping for a quick answer, and this is not going to be a quick answer. Um, the favorite aircraft that I do is usually the one I tend to work on. I'm not somebody who says that really was the one just yet. I have to say the inside the cockpit episode I did on the ME262 and the Heinkel HE111. Well, it's a Spanish one, so it's a Casa 211, 2111 at the Deutsche Museum. That was really interesting. That was very, very interesting getting close to those and having a look inside. The Heinkel was completely restored from the inside, based on Spanish specs mainly. The ME262, I didn't get into the cockpit, but I was allowed to look into the cockpit and put my camera in there. That was fantastic. Um, I really enjoyed the Fiat G91 in the Militärhistorische Museum in Berlin-Gatto. Also a fantastic collection. If anybody's in Berlin at some point in their lives, go there. Lots of Warsaw Pact and NATO aircraft there. Fiat G91, it has perhaps one of the most comfortable cockpits that I have ever sat in. Being Italian, they understand how to make somebody feel comfortable. inside a vehicle. Um, the Finnish Aviation Museum down in up in Helsinki, Vantaa. Um, that just sticks out because it was the first museum that allowed me to go there. I didn't have any inside the cockpit before that, and they just said, "Yes, come by, film what you want." So I always remember them with fond memories because they, together with the Yorkshire Air Museum, right at the Halifax and the Hanley Page Halifax, were sort of the museums that let's say they took the gamble with me, and I think it paid off handsomely for them. And it has made Inside the Cockpit into a series that was viable because once I had those videos, I could link them to other museums and say, hey, this is what I do. And of course, the last one I would mention is the RAF Museum and the Avro Vulcan. I got inside the Avro Vulcan there, and that was fantastic. We had the official tour guide with us as well on that day, and he was explaining the whole aircraft, the history of the whole aircraft, and pointing bits and bobs out as well. And that is also an aircraft that, under normal circumstances, you could visit yourself. So the RAF Museum does have a guided tour, I think twice a year, where you can sit inside their Phantom, the Phantom 2, FGR 2, I think, as the Brits called it, that specific one. And you can also sit in the Avro Vulcan. It is a paid tour, but it is a free museum as well, so keep that in mind. And you really are getting an experience that is one of a kind. So if you have the money and if you have the interest, if you are in London or planning to be in London, check out the dates for that and book well in advance. And I mean like well in advance because the tickets for that sell out very quickly because it's absolutely fantastic.
Nice.
So yeah, those were my favorites essentially. But yeah, I mean it's any aircraft that I can get my hands on. Oh, I forgot to mention the MS 406 that I did in Switzerland.
That one I found really interesting.
Yes. So that one has a special piece in my memory as well because the pilot, he was absolutely fantastic. He showed me the aircraft. He made sure that everything was ready to set up for filming. Filming went a little bit over time. It was an active aerodrome, so we couldn't film all the time because people were landing and taking off, noise, and so on and so forth. Um, and sadly, a couple of months after I filmed that aircraft, that the pilot sadly died. And yeah, so that Inside the Cockpit episode is also in memory of him. And I really have fond memories of chatting with him about the aircraft and him telling me about his experiences with it. And it's he had a lot of patience for me as well for the just the delays that were happening on that day. But yeah, that's also one that sticks out.
Uh,
Sorry, a bit of a sad note there at the
yeah,
end, but
yeah. It's. I did have sort of one last question just regarding this, and this one's probably, hopefully, a bit quicker to answer. But
yeah, sorry.
how much feedback do you receive from the museums after you've released your episodes? Like, do they tell you what they think of your episodes and sort of give you feedback on if your videos have driven more traffic to their museums?
I do get feedback, yes. Usually it's more casual like that. They like the video, they like what they see. They see the comments, they see people saying, "Oh, that museum is just 20 miles from my place. I'm gonna visit it," and so on. And then obviously when they talk with their customers, every now and then you have somebody who says like, "Oh, I saw that video and that's why I came." Um, and it's also a great way. Actually, it's just reminding people of that these museums exist, and just giving them an impetus to visit for the first time or again. Because it's interesting. What I found interesting is that quite a few people don't realize that they have an aviation museum within driving distance of their place, right? And you sometimes have this moment where people get the attention of the museum. And then, yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I had never heard anything negative, so I think they're happy, and I'm happy as well.
Yeah, that's
Fantastic.
exactly why I was actually thinking about thinking about doing a bit of a thing on my end for Point Cook because I said I know it's there because
Yeah,
my father used to be stationed there. I was 8 years old walking around on the tarmac watching F-111s come in on that place. I
yeah,
know it's there. But if you didn't know it was there, you can drive through the town that is sitting right next to, and you will
yeah,
not realize there is one sign on a roundabout that has an arrow that says RAAF Museum, and that's it. That's
Yeah.
the only, and as far as I'm aware, it's the only advertising the place has. It's got F-111s in it, Canberra bombers. It's the home of Australia's the RAAF's P-51. It's got the only complete original example of a Sopwith Walrus in
Mhm.
there. Mirages.
Got, got
It's
the Doomerang.
if you ever get down, yeah, it's got a proper Doomerang. It's got a Bush
Oh, wow.
Ranger configured
Oh,
UH-1H in there. If you ever get down this end of the world, I'm gonna make a few phone calls and introduce you to the curator, because you and him will have a fantastic discussion down there.
that would be
But
fantastic.
yeah, nobody knows it's there. You can drive right past it and you'll have absolutely no idea. At most, you might think it's some private airfield, or just like little commercial
Yeah.
airfield for Cessnas to come in on, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the
It's sad how little they're marked.
yeah, that's sort of a tragedy is a big word,
Mm,
but
mm,
it is sad that a lot of these places don't really get the attention that they deserve. And it's also oftentimes like I speak with museums all the time about this sort of stuff, and it's really uh, for them it's a question of manpower. They a lot of
mm,
museums generally speaking are not a money printing machine, right? They're lucky if they are in positive figures, but
mm,
for a lot of museums it's going from one month to the other, and being reliant on oftentimes donations, on the gift shop, on guided tours that are being sold on, and in many cases if they're not publicly funded, also on entry tickets. So
mm,
they oftentimes do not have the funds or the time or the um,
mm.
sometimes even the expertise, it must be said, to really do a lot of advertisement online and so on. So if you or I can take that load off them and say like, okay, well, we're coming to come here, we're doing this all for free, access to the aircraft, and we'll have tens, if not 100,000 people watching this and getting interest in your museum and come and visit. Perfect for them, and it's a great way of sharing aviation history with people.
Yeah. I guess if they want a moral to complete the podcast here on there for everybody who checks this out both on YouTube and who's watching now on Twitch, after this is done, at the very least, open up a local map and see if you've actually got an aviation museum that's somewhere near you. And if
Yes.
COVID allows for it, depending on where you are in the world, go and visit the place, because they probably need the foot traffic, and you'll see some cool stuff that you never realized was there.
Yeah. And buy
Mm,
something from the gift shop if it's within your means and within your interest. It
yeah.
helps them a lot.
Mm. Well, I think that's as I said, the start of this one. We we tend never to hit our target time. We're going to run it for about an hour and a half now, so we'll bring this one here to a close. Thank you everybody for coming. I'll let you give yourself a final shill for everything, and I'll make sure I put links in the in the descriptions and everywhere else, so everyone can find the books and everything else. But yeah, you guys take it away.
Yeah, I mean, if people arrived at this point in time and are still listening, you know what I do. So on YouTube, Military Aviation History, the links are in the description below, as Max said. If you're interested in aircraft, come and swing by, say hello, see if you like what I do, and if you do, subscribe. And yeah, thanks very much.
No problem. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and we will be back hopefully a little bit more regularly from now on. We already have our next guest queued up, which you could possibly, if you've listened through this podcast already, guess who it'll be, but I'll leave that to when we actually do the podcast. Yeah, thanks for listening, and
He's
we'll see you
very
next time.
he's very visually orientated.
Yes.
All right, thanks for having me on. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Take care, guys.